Hello and welcome to part number 5, which is also the final part of this video series, where we talk about the most violent incidences that I've experienced in my own social life and what you can learn from them. We talked about all the incidents that I've really experienced where a physical fight actually started to break out. And what stood out is that most of these fights didn't escalate to full-on fists flying. Mind you, I've approached roughly 3,000 people in my life. I kept track of it roughly. So from those, it turns out only a handful, 4 or 5 interactions turned into some kind of violent altercation. That's not a lot. And also, as we saw, most of these fights never really broke out. They were stopped or avoided. And that's, of course, also because of my rather non-confrontative nature. I was always a bit of a more diplomatic guy and not the person who is looking for fights. Other people, in some of the examples that we discussed in the last video, for example, would have probably started fighting back much more aggressively. But it's also because I realized over time and with all these experiences that usually letting the fight escalate is just not a good idea. There are much better ways to even pay it back to the aggressor that avoid yourself being put at risk. And to prove this, I'm going to tell you the one story of violence in my life where the fight actually did turn into a real fight and there was no way to avoid it at some point. But you'll see that in this story, the reason it escalated to that level was mainly my own stupidity. And to be very honest, this was a time in my life where I was kind of looking for fights. I was a bit frustrated with the fact that fights don't happen to me and I don't get into real trouble. And if you look at the movies, right, every hero gets into a fist fight at some point. And I was like, why is this not happening to me? So once during that period, I was taking the train back home after a night at the bar and I was sitting there doing my meditation because that's how I like to use the time on commuter trains. I was starting to get into the zone, repeating my mantra, and suddenly from the back I hear this spitting noise. I try to calm back down. I'm like, let's not disturb the meditation. Return to the breath, return to the mantra. And a few seconds later, once again, same sound. Now, at this point, my mind was racing. The meditation was over. I was like, who is spitting in the train? So I got up, I walked towards where the sound was coming, and there's this grim figure, like really slouched, with a base cap pulled into his face, and a beer bottle in his hand, and 2 puddles of spit right in front of him. And I say, hey, you have to clean this up, man. And he says, what do you want? Bugger off, get lost. I said, no man, that's not cool. You can't just spit on the floor. And there was a sense of responsibility coming up here where I said, hey, this is public space, but it's also my hometown. And I feel like called to maintain a certain civil order here. I've had experiences like this before in India when I was visiting people spitting on the floor in the airport, inside. And there also I was thinking about doing something, but in the end I didn't feel belonging and home enough to confront the person. Here in Berlin, I was like, this is not acceptable. I'm going to stand up to this. And so when he declined to clean it up, I took his backpack, which was sitting right next to his legs on the floor, and pulled it into that spit. Through one puddle and through the other puddle. And that's when he jumped up and he said, who do you think you are? I can spit wherever I want. And he spits another big chunk of saliva and mucus right next to me on the floor. And that's when I knew this is what I had been waiting for. My fight has finally come. And just to seal the deal, I took his base cap off his head and threw it into that 3rd puddle of spit and rubbed it in with my foot in this Jackie Chan movie scene moment. And that's when he ran into me, started punching me. And yeah, that's when I didn't have any way to avoid the fight anymore. It was close quarter combat, right, within the corridor of a commuter train. In that moment, I was obviously happy that I had learned a little bit of self-defense. I knew how to block punches and I knew how to throw some back. Luckily, someone came in between after a few punches were exchanged, and then the train came to a halt at the next station and I got off with a broken glass, no more damage. I got lucky again. Looking back, it was unnecessary to push it that far. I actually think a better way for me to have resolved this situation would have been to take out some tissue paper and clean it up myself. This is what I do now when someone litters or throws even just a cigarette stub on the platform of a station. I often go there and I just pick it up myself and throw it to the next trash can. They often are extremely angered by this gesture, but also they don't say anything because they know it's the right thing to do. I think that's how you teach them a real lesson, when you just perform the behavior that you would have expected from them in a very humble way, without words, without confronting, without explaining, just by showing and moving away and letting them sit in that pain, in that awkwardness, in that embarrassment. Now, looking back at all of these incidents of violence in my life, I have to say I'm quite grateful for these experiences. I got lucky, I got away, I never got hurt, but there were some serious risks, and I think that's necessary. It's necessary to approach violence sometimes in order to have a deep certainty that you can deal with it. Because when you have experienced some forms of violence every now and then, you know that you don't have to be super afraid of it. You know that you can act wisely because you have learned your lessons. And there will be situations in your life where facing violence will be inevitable. They might not be a lot depending on your background, but once or twice you will have a situation where you can't run away, where you're maybe even responsible for someone else, where it's not you who's attacked, but someone else that you are responsible protecting. There was a situation like this recently in my life where someone kind of unintentionally, but also recklessly hurt my mother a little bit, and afterwards didn't want to apologize for it. He didn't see his mistake in the situation. This was a guy from our extended family network who is known to be a bit rough and violent sometimes. No one else really wanted to confront that guy, so I went up to him and sat down with him, risking that it could get heated or even violent, because I knew I could deal with it. When you think about it, the physical edge, the potential of violence is actually an integral part of communication between humans, especially between men. And you cannot really ignore that side. It's always there. It's a much better idea to familiarize yourself with it, to expose yourself more and more to tough situations like this so that you're not sensitive, overly sensitive, and scared of them. Most of the men that I work with actually haven't experienced enough tough situations. And so even when a woman rejects them, it feels so incredibly uncomfortable that they have to take a break for a week. Of course, it's hard when you already got bullied all your life, maybe in school, and now online you see all this racism going on. But you have to get over those patterns. You cannot continue to see getting rejected as something extremely painful, and you should also not see getting into a bit of a brawl with other guys as something extremely painful. So all in all, if you are a person who hasn't really made a lot of experience with physical confrontation, then I do recommend going to nightclubs and testing the boundaries a bit and roughing it out a little with the other guys in there. Of course, you don't want to rely on nightclub environments only, because it's probably not going to be the place where you can excel if that's not something you would usually do. There are going to be other guys there who have more of that physical edge, who are always going to dominate in the nightclub environments. The daytime environment is obviously more suited for people who have strength on the intellectual level, who are really interested in good conversation. If you have trouble implementing all of this on your own and you want to get a precise, personalized action step plan where you learn how to talk to strangers in real life, whether it's in nightlife or during the daytime, and how to turn those interactions into lasting relationships that can lead to marriage and family down the line, then there's a link in the description where you can schedule a one-on-one call with me free of charge. Hope to see some of you there. Thanks for watching. Samgachadvam. Namaskar.